at least in a debate, I sort of lay down the rules of what I believe or what I consider authoritative, right? Which sort of puts me in an advantage because the Torah is not so complex, right? The five books of Moses are pretty straightforward. Do this, don't do that. It really limits the metaphysical, right? So there's not much you could pull out of the five books of Moses outside of believing that God wants you to do X, Y, and Z. In terms of belief, that's interesting. What does a Jew really have to believe? Anyways, does a Jew have to believe anything, or does the Torah just tell him to do? The Torah tells you don't worship false idols, but it doesn't tell you what a Jew must believe. All this was developed later on by the rabbis. Now, clearly, if you don't believe in a good God, a good lawgiver, you're not going to want to keep the law. But outside of not believing in foreign gods, I'm not talking about Trinity or what people call Shituf partnerships, and these are all partnerships within one Godhead, right? But outside of not believing in foreign gods, what does the Torah really expect you to believe in? Nothing. And there's many rabbis who've had that approach. So the three most famous rabbis that give an opinion of what Jews are supposed to believe in. The most famous, the Rambam, right? The Yud Gimel Karamuna, the 13 Principles of Faith. The second most famous, I would say, is Sefer Ikarim. Sefer Ikarim was a book written by Rabbi Albo, I think Rabbi Yosef Albo. So there, he limits it to Gimel, to 3. So the Rambam has a Yud Gimel, the 13. The Sefer Ikarim has 3 things that a Jew must believe in. And then the Radbaz, in a tshuva, says that there's nothing that a Jew has to believe in. If you ask people who believe in Judaism light, and I'll tell you, the vast majority of rabbis who teach online, I'm not saying in the yeshiva system, but just like your average YouTube rabbi, teaches Judaism light. All they know is pop Judaism. Like whatever is popular, whatever what the average Baal Tshuva or convert or no-white knows, right? Oh, a Jew must believe in the 13 principles of faith. Well, don't forget, the Rambam was a Rishon. He wasn't a Tana. He wasn't one of the Zugos. So the 13 principles of faith are ultimately the Rambam's opinion. Only opinion, it's not halacha.
You have to do that when you're converting, though, yeah? You have to actually spell out the 13 principles of faith.
Well, they've incorporated it in our daily prayers. When we say Yigdal, so Yigdal in the morning prayer is basically the 13 principles of faith that we're uttering. Now, a surprise to most people, the 13 principles of faith, as we have them today, was not written by the Rambam, not in that manner. Someone later on abridged basically all he wrote in his introduction to Perek Chelek, is 98 of Masechet Sanhedrin. So there, he wrote a whole long introduction, really, it's a Hakdama, of what a Jew must believe based on that portion in the Talmud. And then someone later on abridged it into 13 principles of faith, but it's not written in the abridged form. In the form, in the Ani Mamin and the Yigdal, that someone else wrote. The Rambam didn't write that. There's even ideas in there that the way it's phrased, the notion that one has to wait for the Messiah daily, the Rambam never wrote that. Now, he believed, yes, the belief in the Messiah is one of the 13 principles of faith, but the notion that you have to wait for him daily, someone took the Rambam's work and abridged it in such a manner that it said that. So Israel, as a whole, first has to do tshuva. It's not that he's going to fall out of the sky, like many mystics believe. But if it's true that a Jew is not really required to believe anything, but he's required to do, right? I mean, where does the Torah tell you to believe anything? Closest thing is to love God, but that could also be understood as an act. So that's the opinion of the Radbaz. In a tshuva, he says, the tshuva is interesting. It says that they asked him a question, what do you do with this rabbi who has weird beliefs? Like, should we kick him out of the community, this and that? So he says, no. He expresses the notion that a Jew is not they're required to believe anything. But then at the end of the tshuva, he says something else interesting. He says that you should get him to stop teaching these crazy ideas. And if he doesn't tell me about it, then I'll come down on him like a wall or something like that. So it's kind of like an ambiguous tshuva, but he does preface it by saying that Jews are not required to believe anything. And I know that this sounds a bit shocking to a lot of counter-missionaries out there. Heck, I mean, I myself also fancy myself a counter-missionary, mainly because of the approach that modern-day Judaism takes, let's say, not with people who completely deny Torah Shebektav and Torah Sheba'al Peh, saying that it doesn't apply to them, it doesn't, or to even let's say, a Hebrew rooter or a Messianic Jew who claims or tries to keep all of Torah Shabbat and Torah Shabbat Peh, but happens to believe that JC is his Messiah, or even some sort of earthly representation of the God of Israel. And this is why that the argument typically thrown against these people is Avodah Zarah. This is idolatry. But technically, it's the God of Israel in partnerships, right? It's not the service or the worship of some foreign god, right? I mean, it's very similar to the Sefirot in Judaism, different emanations trying to explain the complexity of God's unity. Because clearly, idolatry or the worship of foreign gods, literally foreign worship, is prohibited in Torah. This is why, in my opinion, Messianic Judaism at least gets some sort of a pass. Even though, I mean, I debate a lot of Messianic Jews because I do believe that having an incorrect belief system will affect you in the long run. But I can't say that Torah teaches this. I can't say that they're breaking something in Torah by believing thus if they're keeping Torah, especially while acknowledging the author of Torah. But anyways, Sefer HaIkarim by Rabbi Yosef Albo, the three things he mentions is the existence of God, the revelation from God, and schar ve'onesh, i.e. reward and punishment. So here, Rabbi Albo, we know that he's mystically inclined, so this reward and punishment is about an afterlife, not necessarily the physical reward and the physical punishment that appears in Torah Shebektav. And from these three, he also creates subcategories on this, like in terms of believing in God and not believing that he's corporeal and all these things, so he also goes a little further than three, but he limits it to three. You have to understand that by the simple fact that the rabbis on the colloquial level can't even agree upon what a Jew must believe, shows that something like this could never be understood as authoritative. Even, Mark Shapiro writes a book called The Limits of Orthodoxy, where he mentions all the rabbis, many of the rabbis who did not accept the Rambam's 13 principles as binding. And rightly so, because it's just his opinion. I mean, honestly, if you think about it, how could you adjudicate someone from a spiritual level based on what they believe or not believe, right? I mean, if someone happens not to believe something, it's because they're not convinced of it as true, right? He's not convinced of it. God's going to punish you for believing or not believing something you're not convinced of as a religious person, as an ethical person. We're not talking about Chilunim who don't constantly strive to do the right thing. We're talking about religious people here. That's why, at least that point itself makes a case for me. The Torah wants you to do. It doesn't care what you believe, right? And if you needed a quick run through the Rambam's 13 principles, at least how it's been abridged by later groups, again, not how he wrote it, it's understood as belief in the Creator, right? Belief in God. The belief also in his unparalleled unity, right? The unity of God. The belief that also that God is not corporeal in any way. The belief that God is eternal. The obligation to only worship God himself and no foreign God. The belief that God communicates to man through prophets, right? And also, along with that, the belief in our supreme prophet, Moshe Rabbeinu, our teacher. Along with the belief that the Torah is divine in its immutability, the belief that God is omniscient, the belief, as Sefer HaIkarim mentions, of schar ve'onesh, reward and punishment, the belief in the arrival of the Messiah, Techiyat HaMeitim, the resurrection of the dead. And I think, that tops the 13 there. Now, one reason one could think that it must have been the Rambam to come up with these principles when he did, because it was ultimately the Rambam who laid down philosophy for the first time in the Jewish world. A lot of these principles are detailed and outlined in Mor Nevuchim in his Guide for the Perplexed, in detail.
So how does this tie to our class about Christianity or Christians and giving them the full benefit of the doubt? That really could toss out the whole notion of you believing someone is or is not the Messiah. That doesn't really, that's not enough, at least from a Mishnaic perspective, to throw someone under the bus for, right? Although there are statements in the Talmud, there's a famous statement. This is why the Rambam brings it down in his 13 principles of believing in Techiyat HaMeitim and the resurrection of the dead, that if one fails to believe in it, they won't partake in it. Fine. But there are many different statements in the Talmud that are not from a prescriptive legal nature, that people don't take seriously. Parshat Shoftim in Deuteronomy chapter 17, regarding the role or the office of the judge, God tells you whether you have to heed their instructions in terms of doing, not of believing. The only thing that lays down belief is Torah Shabbat, the 5 books of Moses, right? Because that's what we received from God. It's Himself. I mean, clearly, faith plays a big part in our religion. As much as many Jews want to run away from the word faith because they think it's in some way sounds Christian, Jew has, I would say even more faith. Heck, the New Testament is 27 books, but the book of the Zohar is probably 5 times the size of that. Every year they add more stuff to it.
I've been reading the first introduction to the Zohar just over the weekend, and the way that they equate Maimonides and his Mishnah Torah, like when he first wrote, or maybe it was just his previous writing, they said that all Maimonides' writings were heresy prior to, hence they say that the Zohar is heresy as well. But then they will come around to it and say, okay, well, this is actually legitimate. This is actually more from God, as they say.
Yeah, whoever said that doesn't have a good grasp of how Judaism works. The reason people didn't like Maimonides' writings, that wasn't because they had an issue with Mishnah Torah or anything halachic he wrote, but with Mor Nevuchim. So Mor Nevuchim, Guide for the Perplexed, is all opinion. And everybody agrees it's opinion. It's a book of philosophy. Like, he wrote it for his student, right? So then he quotes Plato, he quotes Aristotle. And this is why his books were problematic. But everyone understands that Mor Nevuchim is, it's philosophy. Although I would say everything that we know in Judaism today about monotheism comes from the Rambam, mainly in that Sefer. Because the Talmud is, this notion of monotheism and not limiting God and saying that God has no corporeal qualities doesn't really appear in the Talmud. Many of the Tosafists, the students of Rashi, did believe that God had a shape, right? I'm not saying they believe he was like basar v'dam, blood and flesh, but there are people who believe. It says in the Talmud, God wears tefillin, that God has a talus, right? You can't wear tefillin and have a talus unless you have a shape, right? So this would have been things that the Rambam would have been against. Yeah, people always try to use the Rambam saying, well, they rejected him, and I think even Jesus says similar things, Like, if they mistreat you, just know that they mistreated me first, right? I don't know how that makes it any better, but I think that's the same argument this guy's saying. It's like, if they didn't accept, if your friend doesn't accept the Zohar, it's fine, because they didn't accept the Rambam's works either. But it wasn't the Mishnah Torah. But the issue they have with Mishnah Torah, I think the only main issue, outside of the fact that people were against him writing one main codification of Jewish law. As a matter of fact, he called his work Mishneh Torah, but they renamed it to the Yad HaChazaka, because Mishneh Torah, what the argument was, he has the chutzpah to call his work Torah. Mishneh Torah means basically second Torah. It's what people used to call the Book of Devarim, because it's a repetition of the law. So his understanding was that now that you have my work, all you need is basically Torah Shabbat, the 5 books of Moses, and this book that will cover all of Torah Shabbat Peh. So people had a problem with him laying down what Torah Shabbat Peh actually is, because everyone had their own Masorah. In other words, they're not denying works like the Mishnah and Talmud Bavli, Talmud Yerushalmi, Sifrat Sefri, Mechilta, the Toseftot, but forcing people to go by one Masorah, right? 'Cause sometimes there's 2 or 3, different opinions. Sometimes that we don't know how to paskin, right? So the Rambam had his own Masorah on how he read the text and what halacha in the ambiguous portions he went by. All right, which I think it's a good thing, but many people didn't. Right. So if you view Judaism like that in terms of what you do and not necessarily what you believe, and then you begin including a lot of people in your belief system. Now, groups like Karaites would be a problem because they deny Torah Shabbat Peh. God's going to hold them against one huge mitzvah, which is the mitzvah of lo tasud, of not straying from what the court decides. It's funny. Virtually every time I've ever discussed Judaism with a Karaite, I maybe have 5 or 6 debates on my page. They're never up on the whole notion of the Sanhedrin and the court and Parshat Shoftim, and it's